This is a scholarly philosophical discussion about the definitions and is not intended to stir up any negativity or hate. A word that's thrown around a lot these days is one that I talked about in an early draft of my book, Western Self-Contempt, but which I had to delete in the end before publication for reasons of length. And so I'll present my thoughts on that subject here instead. Now, the use of this word, the G word, is an example of how bad our education systems have become. It shows how the prison of language tends to arrest people's minds and to render them even more orthophobic than they already were, as, again, can be seen in their use of the G word. So, what do I mean by this? Well, the G word, as some of you may have figured out by now, is genocide. Now, genocide is obviously one of the worst things of which one can accuse anyone, like when American orthophobes accuse America of genocide against Native Americans, or when Western orthophobes accuse Israel of genocide against Palestinians. While language and thought are, of course, intimately connected, we must guard against letting this connection become too binding. And this happens when words begin to hold back thought. Words hold back thought sometimes because the words usually develop and change meaning quite slowly, whereas thought moves very quickly. And so the term genocide is a clear case of how language not only influences, but in fact imprisons thought. Now, because it happens all too often that a particular term will become so ingrained in people's minds, it will be applied indiscriminately to vastly different phenomena in the real world. False intellectuals and self-satisfied sophisticates will then spread such terms, and they let a philosophically realist love of words erase the actual particularities and differences that characterize different events and different phenomena. Some other expressions, apart from genocide, that are often abused like this and hold thought back because they're repeated without too much thought behind them are human rights, jus in bello, law of war, equality, and, my personal favorite, correlation does not equal causation. So let's get into some details. A few scholars in the past have tried to establish various taxonomies, arrangements of genocide, and these have been more or less accurate. For example, Leo Cooper, Types of Genocide and Mass Murder, distinguishes between domestic and international genocides, as well as among ethnic, racial, religious, scapegoat, and political types. Kurt Jonassen and Frank Chalk, A Typology of Genocide and Some Implications for the Human Rights Agenda, raise the relevance of intent. Intent is also an important factor in the United Nations Treaty known as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Intent, in fact, is not just a mental distinction, but we'll see in a moment that the presence or absence of intent also leads to very different outcomes in the real world. For fuller bibliography on this topic, see Martin Shaw, Genocide from Oxford Bibliographies. I'll provide a link below. Now, these various taxonomies do have their merits, but here I want to offer a somewhat different distinction, and one that is based on a very clear difference, but a distinction that is glossed over when lots of very different events are equally referred to as genocide. There are two main forms to consider here, and they are indeed radically different, but since the same word is so often used to describe them, people mistakenly believe that they are morally or even practically equivalent. And this is, again, an example of how people's thoughts are captured by language, as I was saying before. Now, the term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, Axis rule in occupied Europe. But once a word has been established, it prevents people from seeing what may be insufficient about it or what its limitations may be. And so they don't notice how there is a slow semantic shift toward incorporating other phenomena into the word, a shift that is then sanctified after the fact by scholars who, as so often, have a political agenda. And no word, by the way, illustrates this problem as clearly as the word racism, but that is a story for another time. So, the word genocide first appeared and spread during history's most genocidal century, the 20th, and Lemkin meant to describe the Nazi Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. But it was then retroactively applied to many events that were very different from those genocides. Now, since genocide is one of the most odious crimes of which anyone can be accused, this semantic shift is thus a way of forcing ideological opponents out of the discussion. It's also a postmodern style simplification of the world in that it reduces as many phenomena as possible to the univariable of power and oppression, even though human motivation is so much more complex than that. So in terms of genocide, or supposed genocide, the two groups of events that I would distinguish from each other can be called economic on the one hand and ethnic on the other. Let's talk about the economic one first. This is the process by which a more advanced economic system gradually marginalizes a more primitive economic system. When this happens, the members of the society with a more advanced system come to gradually replace those of the less advanced system. The latter people either die or they are absorbed into the population of the former. Usually there is a combination of the two. A more advanced economic system will require different resources and especially a different use of the available land, for example, through farming or pastoralism as opposed to hunting and gathering. And the members of the primitive economic system will therefore be killed or expelled when and if they resist. But from a moral point of view, it's important to note that the killing of those people is generally not motivated in the first instance by an antipathy toward the people themselves, but rather by a desire to make space for the more advanced system. Now, antipathy toward the more primitive people will usually occur, and of course racial animosity might heighten the intensity of the conflict and might exacerbate the bitterness of the struggle, but this antipathy arises once the economic systems have already proven themselves incompatible with each other. And for this reason, and also because the replacement of one economic system by another usually takes place over many generations, there is no, or only very rare, wholesale killing of the more primitive population. Rather, the killing takes place in smaller bursts over a long period of many years. Also, since the main goal is the propagation of one's own economic system rather than the destruction of the more primitive population per se, the losers in the struggle will sometimes have the opportunity of integrating into the new system, and so therefore they don't have to be rooted out and killed completely. This economic process has taken place since prehistory, but is almost non-existent now. Examples, among literally hundreds or even thousands, include the destruction of the Neanderthals by the Cro-Magnons in Europe. This is at least a possibility. Austronesian expansion in Indonesia and the Philippines, circa 3rd millennium BC. The destruction of Mycenaean culture by the Dorians, or the so-called Sea Peoples, around 1000 BC. This is slightly uncertain, but probably. The Zhou Chinese marginalization of non-Chinese, 1st millennium BC. The uprooting of Khoisan peoples by Bantu peoples in southern Africa. The European settlement of Aboriginal Australia. And, most famously, the disappearance of the Native American upon European colonization. Because this last event, as one of the most recent examples of the economic process, is so well documented, especially here in the United States, it is all too often conflated with actual genocide. Because it really shouldn't be called genocide at all, since the destruction of the people as a whole is not the ultimate goal or intent. And here's the importance of intent again that I mentioned before. Confusing this with the ethnic process, which I'll discuss in a moment, is in fact an affront to human decency and intelligence. Rather, a word like civicide, policide, or oikocide would be preferable, since these would suggest the destruction of a political entity or environment rather than primarily of the flesh and blood human beings themselves. In fact, in Book 1 of his Politics, Aristotle writes that when two states are juxtaposed to each other, and one is far stronger than the other, the subjugation of one by the other is, as unpleasant as it may be, also an entirely natural development, as opposed to an evil and racist cabal of conspirators intent on world domination. and this is part of the tragedy of the human condition. What I call the ethnic process is very different, and it's the only one of these two that should properly be called genocide. I describe it as ethnic here because of that word's Greek meaning. An ethnos is a discrete people. In the ethnic process, the effort is not primarily economic, but rather it is to destroy the people itself because of a perceived inferiority of race, religion, politics, or overall culture. In the ethnic process, killing is massive, swift, and deliberate. And that is the real moral as well as practical difference between the ethnic, or I should say actual, genocide, and the economic process that I talked about before. Whereas civicide or policide or oikocide takes place over a very long time and also tends to have the historical inevitability of economic progress attached to it, actual genocide is much more willful, and it therefore takes place over a much shorter period of time. Typical ethnic genocides have also been numerous in history. In the 20th century alone, we have classic examples like the aforementioned Armenian genocide by the Ottomans and the Nazi Holocaust, as well as the Khmer Rouge killing of Cambodians, the Hutu genocide of the Tutsi, and the Iraqi gassing under Saddam Hussein of Kurds. Earlier examples of genocide proper, also at a time when civicide or policide or oikocide was still common, would probably include the Roman destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, the Turco-Mongol destruction of Christians in the 1390s, and the Aztecs' complete wiping out of some select surrounding tribes around 1490. There are also sometimes hybrid forms, as when there is an economic clash that leads to a marginalization without exterminating intent, but where friction between the two populations subsequently does lead to an exterminating intent, which is then put into action. An example of this would be the German wiping out of most of the Herero tribe in the early 20th century. Alternatively, one could argue that this is not a hybrid form, but simply that the opening economic process is followed by the ethnic process without this having initially been the plan. In any case, this last example is especially poignant for me personally, since I actually lived and worked for a while with the Herero tribe in the Kalahari Desert. This distinction between the economic and the ethnic processes reveals that American orcophobes only exhibit their ignorance and orcophobic vanity when they say that they have no right to criticize, for example, the Germans, since America has also committed genocide. And indeed, one sometimes hears some smug Germans thinking themselves clever say the same thing. The tragic event of the destruction of the Native American, and it is tragic, and the tragic event of the Nazi Holocaust are so extremely different that the same word, genocide, cannot, or at least should not, be equally applied to them. They were two radically different categories of event. The conflation of these two categories is typical of a postmodern culture in which people exult and jubilate the moment they find something that can be called oppressive, and it tends to ignore all the important points of difference. It is also, as I've been saying, a further example of orcophobia, at least when Americans criticize America for so-called genocide against Native Americans, and earnestly believe that it is in any way comparable to what the Nazis did to Jews, gays, gypsies, and the mentally disabled. And it is, again, an example of how we only understand the world through specific words or expressions, and of how our thoughts become the prisoners of language, as I was saying in the beginning. Another recent example of this problem was when people started yelling appeasement when certain world leaders understood the difficult situation on the ground in the Ukraine war. Those who yelled this only understand the world or history through certain preset words or slogans, and they thereby become incapable of recognizing important differences and distinctions in the real world. All this also belies, naturally, the childish contemporary public discourse in which everything that one does not like is genocide, or racism for that matter. What is currently happening in the Middle East, for example, bears no resemblance to the categories that I've been discussing here. Israeli action against Palestinian terrorists is simply war. It's actually even less than war, and more properly just counterinsurgency, since in a full-fledged war, Israel, which enjoys total air superiority, could simply level all of Gaza from the air without the loss of a single soldier. Palestinian terrorist action against Israel, on the other hand, would qualify as genocide insofar as the action has as its explicit intent the extermination of all Jews, men, women, and children. De facto, it's not full-scale genocide, however, because it has not been anywhere close to successful and never will be. And so we find that there are certain thought cliches that must be jettisoned if we are to think freely. And if you made it this far, you might as well like, subscribe, and click the bell icon down below. I'm counting on it. Thank you.